love stories. It's one of those things that I think got from my mother. Specifically, she loves to read, and so I've picked that up from her. I come by it honestly. There are many things that I get from my dad, rugged good looks, humility. But from my mother, one of the things that I got was love of stories and love of reading. And again, it has served me just well so far. For my wife, her father is a writer, and so she enjoys stories as well. And so then I guess it was a given. Perhaps my kids were destined to love stories too. And so all of us in our family are story lovers. We love to read. In fact, here in a couple of weeks, we're going to be taking a vacation. And as we were planning that vacation, we allocated one of those days just for reading together, which is fantastic with inflation because it costs nothing or nearly nothing. And so I'm happy about that. I think there's a great time, summer, for stories. There's nothing like sitting out in the hammock right about now and just reading. I enjoy it. And so last week we started this series called Stories for the Summer. Specifically, we're reading stories of extraordinary women from the Bible. And of course, we can't cover all of them. Somewhere between half and 3/4 of this thing is narrative, depending on what all you think is narrative. And so we couldn't cover all of the stories of extraordinary women of the Bible in 4 weeks. We couldn't even cover some of the most extraordinary stories exhaustively. But a good story doesn't have to be exhaustive. I don't know if you've ever known anybody who loves to tell stories but doesn't know how. Those conversations are the worst. They major in minor details and leave out important pieces, and then you never get to the punchline. You're like, I think there's a story in here somewhere. But I love stories. So we're not trying to be exhaustive with this. Instead, what we've decided is we're going to just cover, I guess you could say, stories of extraordinary women in ordinary places. So that's what we started last week. And for today, we'll call it When the Story Goes Sideways. When the Story Goes Sideways. Grab your Bibles, open them up to 2 Kings chapter 4 this morning. 2 Kings chapter 4. At some point, we'll get another opportunity to go to Israel. It was such a moving and remarkable experience for me that I just cannot see not going back. And I often hear from people who go who feel the exact same way. But if you missed the opportunity and you're like, man, I wish I would have gone, there will be most likely another opportunity for you to go at some point. One of the things that people had told me ahead of time that is so true is that when you go, you find one of the missing or silent characters of the Bible that some people call the land itself the fifth gospel. Like, it's the piece that if you don't know it's there, you might totally miss it, and yet it's such a central part of the story. And the point at which I realized that was actually on day one. We were standing in Mount Carmel, in the Carmel mountain range, and we were looking out towards the Jezreel Valley, which I had read about countless times. It is a vital part of the story of the people of Israel. It comes up over and over and over again. But we were standing there on the place that is traditionally thought of to be the place where Elijah confronted the prophets of Baal. And looking out towards the Jezreel Valley, I never could have imagined what it actually looked like. And so I snapped a photo. There's plenty of selfies, but I want to show you a photo just of the space. I took a panorama to show you what it looks like. Because it isn't until you see something like this, or at least being there and seeing it, that you feel more the texture of the land, and there is a texture to it. One of my favorite, I guess you could call them, even just souvenirs that I brought back was a very cheap, inexpensive, plastic, three-dimensional map of the Holy Land. Here's a picture of that. And what I loved about it is you can feel the texture of the land because there are two mountain ranges, essentially, that go through Israel on either side of the Jordan River. It is not flat like Illinois. There is texture to the land. And so sometimes when I'm reading stories, I will run my fingers over that and see where things happen. This, for me, was absolutely profound. And so since that time, as I read stories, I need some way to be able to visualize the space these things are happening in. So I've started using Google Earth. I love Google Earth. It's not perfect, but at least when you look at it, you can get a feel for the space. So let's talk about the Jezreel Valley, which is today's story where it happens. It extends not just a small distance, but all the way from that Carmel Mountain range in the west, all the way across to the Jordan Valley and Jordan River in the east. It is a vital part of the story. A lot of the things that you find happen there. When you are on the major land bridge between the powers of your day and you need to move from west to east or east to west, where can you go if there's mountains everywhere? Well, you go through the Jezreel Valley. And so this place is of vital significance and strategic value, but it's also absolutely rich. Most of it at this point is used agriculturally because it is a rich and lush land. And even now it's used, then it was even more so. It is rich, it is beautiful. Today's story is actually going to take place right in the middle of the Jezreel Valley, this very important location in a little town called Shunem. It's right next to a mountain. You can call it a mountain, but it's really more of a hill, Mount Morah. It's a small town, but it's a beautiful space. In fact, just to the northeast of this mountain, you will see another little town called Naam. Now, this little town is named that because Jacob, when he saw this land, said that it was a pleasant land, and that's what it means. And so this whole place is a lush and rich location. And of course, as you can imagine, in a flat plain area, in a valley like Jezreel Valley, if there is in the middle of that a raised area, that is of strategic value as well. If there's a large hill right in the middle of a valley, then that would be a place where if you're putting down the army for the night, you would want to be, because it's always harder to go up than come down. And so if someone's going to attack, that's where you want to be. So this story that we're going to read today happens in this little town of Shunem, right next to Mount Morah, about 20 miles east of the Carmel Mountain range, which had been the power base of the prophets of Baal until Elijah defeats them. And then it becomes the base of operations for Elijah and then his successor, Elisha. And so our story is the story of Elisha in this little town of Shunem. 2 Kings chapter 4, verse 8. 2 Kings chapter 4, verse 8. One day, Elisha went to the town of Shunem. A wealthy woman lived there, and she urged him to come to her home for a meal. After that, whenever he passed that way, he would stop there for something to eat. So if he's in the west, in the Carmel Mountain range, and he goes all over the place according to the stories, he goes right through the Jezreel Valley. If you want to go sideways in Israel, you go through the Jezreel Valley. And so here he goes. And he stops at Shunem, and it says there is this woman who is wealthy, and she urges him to stay. Now let me tell you what the story is supposed to be about. This story is supposed to be about Elisha and how he is twice as good as Elijah. Because in 2 Kings chapter 2, verse 9, Elijah was getting ready to ascend to heaven, whatever exactly that means. And Elisha says to him, hey, I want a double portion of what you got. I want double the spirit of what you have. And Elijah says, go home. And Elisha says, as surely as the Lord lives and you live, I am not going anywhere. And Elijah tells him again to go home. And he says, as surely as the Lord lives and you live, I am not going anywhere. And so Elijah says, well, if you see me when I go up, maybe the Lord will give you double what I got. And so he sees Elijah as he goes up, and he gets double what Elijah got. At least that's what the writer is trying to tell us. You see that Elijah had 8 miracles. Elisha has recorded 16. And those miracles, it seems, the writer is at pains to say, are of a greater quality even than Elijah's miracles. And so this miracle is one of those in a series of miracles. And so that's what this story is supposed to be about. But sometimes the story goes sideways. Sometimes a supporting actor outshines the lead. Sometimes there is someone else who's on the scene, who everybody grabs their attention. For us, as a family, we want to tell our kids stories. And so we decided we'd never actually watch Star Wars with them. And I don't know about you, but when you're deciding to show your kids movies that you watched growing up, sometimes as you're doing that, you come across stuff that you're like, oh, I don't remember that. Awkward. So like just the other day, we were saying, we got to show them Back to the Future. And I was like, what all's in that? I don't remember for sure. But Star Wars, episode 4, 5, and 6, we want to show them this summer. 1, 2, 3, bleh. 7 through 9, bleh. But 4 through 6, we want to show them those. And so we started with number 4. And I was struck again by the fact that Han Solo far outshines Luke Skywalker. I mean, come on. Mark Hamill and Carrie Fisher were never going to outact Harrison Ford. It just wasn't going to happen. And so he was supposed to be a side character in number 4. And then number 5, he becomes much more central to the story. Because sometimes the story goes sideways. It's like in The Godfather. It was supposed to be about Marlon Brando. But Al Pacino, who was unknown at that time, outshined. And so then, from then on, the rest of the Godfathers are actually about him. Sometimes the story goes sideways. And that's what happens in this story as well. It's supposed to be about Elisha. But in reality, this woman far outshines him. If you don't know it, this story is a favorite of feminist theologians. Those who are trying to prove something. And there's a reason for that. Because this story goes sideways. Even some of the language that's used of her, the word that's used for she urged Elijah to stay, or Elisha to come to her house and eat. That word urged is a little stronger than just urged. It is like she fought with him, she subdued him, and he came to her house to eat dinner, right? Like truly, the word is used for Adonijah when he is holding on to the horns of the altar, right? It is used for the king of Aram when he subdues another king. It's used for another king who beats one of his subjugated kings senseless. That's the word that's used for this woman trying to get Elisha to come to dinner. Does anybody know a woman like that? This reminds me of Elvira Ferrand, my wife's grandmother. Oh man. You are going to come to my house and eat some spaghetti. I mean, like, you didn't have a choice. And that's apparently the case here as well. Even the word that's used for wealthy in this story, it's used 349 other times in Scripture. 549 other times in Scripture. Of those, only twice is it referred to someone's richness or wealth. Vast majority of the time, the word is translated as great. So living in Shunem, there is this great woman. We're never told her name because the writer wants us to focus on Elisha and wants us to focus on Gehazi. They're the only ones who get names in this story. But in spite of that, she makes a name for herself. Shunem, which she is not the only person from Shunem, becomes known for her. She becomes the Shunammite. She is the Shunammite woman. And this is where her story begins. It begins with her grabbing hold of Elisha, probably using his middle name, Elisha ben Shaphat Abel Mahala, you are coming to my house today. And so he does. She makes him dinner. And then, from then on, every time he's going sideways through Israel, he stops and he has a meal. She said to her husband, I am sure this man who stops in from time to time is a holy man of God. Let's build a small room for him on the roof and furnish it with a bed, a table, a chair, and a lamp. And then he will have a place to stay whenever he comes by. This Father's Day, hear the voice of every wife ever who wants a home remodel. She says, let us build. There is very rarely an us in let us build. Most often, she means let you build. But she says, let us build. I love it. For Liz and me, we realize that we're about halfway through this whole parenting thing, right? I mean, my daughter is 13, my son is 10, and so we've got 8 more years until they move out. Maybe we're not in agreement on this. But 8 more years until Asher's 18. And so we realize that often when the kids do move out, you find out you've focused on them for a long time. And boy, sometimes distance can grow in there. And so we decided, boy, we want to like each other when this whole thing is done, right? And so we decided we need to find some things we enjoy doing together. I mean, there are some things that she enjoys doing, crafting, going to thrift stores, that I just absolutely do not like. I mean, I enjoy the fruits of her going to the thrift store. This jacket today was bought by her. I asked her for a nice taupe jacket for Father's Day, and yesterday she went and still smells like a thrift store. It's okay. I'm thankful for it, right? It's got shoulder pads like from the 90s a little bit, and that's okay. Because in the 90s, men had to have broad shoulders. You know what I'm saying? So this was like the men's push-up bra of the 90s. And I'm good with it. Like, I'm all right with a pat on my shoulder like that. Like, and I love the jacket. I love the fruit of it, but I hate going to thrift stores. For me, I'm pretty sure Jesus said, there is no greater love than this, that a man walk into a thrift store. And so on Mother's Day this year, I walked into a thrift store. And I bought her a Mother's Day card from her favorite gift store, a literal mother. It wasn't a Mother's Day card. I think it was a birthday card, and I just crossed some stuff out. But it was from a thrift store, and it demonstrated my deep love for her, right? Anyways, I don't enjoy that. I'm never going to enjoy that. I don't enjoy crafting. Blech. And I'm not. It's not going to happen. And there are things that I enjoy that she doesn't enjoy like I enjoy. And so we were like, we need to find some things we both enjoy doing. And so this last school year on Fridays, when the kids are at school, we thought this is the time to do it. And so we were asking questions. What do we enjoy doing together? And one of the things we came to was working around the house. We enjoy doing projects together, and it's a nice exercise in, not hating each other as you're trying to get something accomplished. And so that's nice. And as we hit summer, I realized that somewhere along the line, this turned into a honey-do list. She pulled, let us build on me. Absolute genius. But that's what she says. Let us build, in spite of the fact that it means let you build. Let the servants build. Let's put a second story up. And what is at the heart of it? Well, it is hospitality. When Elisha is traveling through from west to east, sideways across Israel, here's a place he can stop and eat and rest. And so he does. One day, Elisha returned to Shunem, and he went up to this upper room to rest. And he said to his servant Gehazi, which I feel like Gehazi's parents just missed it barely, right? Like, if they would have changed that A to like E, and maybe softened the G a little bit, his name would be Gehazi, which is the great name for a DJ. DJ Gehazi. So he said to his servant, DJ Gehazi, see, it rolls off the tongue. Tell the woman from Shunem, I want to speak to her. So off Gehazi goes and finds the woman from Shunem. Says he wants to speak to you. Now, I want you to pay attention to something here. How they talk to one another. Okay, just pay attention to the form of communication. When she appeared, Elisha said to Gehazi, tell her, we appreciate the kind concern you have shown us. What can we do for you? Can we put in a good word for you to the king or to the commander of the army? So Elisha has Gehazi go talk to her, get her to come. And when she arrives, he says to Gehazi, tell her, right in front of her, this. And what exactly is happening here, not everybody, like nobody's in agreement. Some people think that he is the man of God. And so, because he is so holy, there needs to be some sort of an intermediary between them. Or it may just be a social construct that because he's a man, she's a woman, that there is someone who goes between and that he is respecting or honoring that. I don't know for sure, but it feels at least a little bit to me like middle school. When you're mad at your best friend, and yet you're at the lunch table and you decided I'm not talking to her, and yet you also need to tell her something. And so you say to your other friend who's sitting in between her, and you tell Sarah that her hair looks really nice today or whatever, and then she goes and relays it. That's the feel that I get to this. But feel that in the midst of the story, he says to Gehazi, ask her if there's anything we can do for her. Can we talk to the king or to the commander of the army? And again, we aren't given the exact names of who those people are. We kind of have an idea. It's either Jehoram is king or Jehu is king. And if Jehoram is king, then Jehu is probably his commander. Because in a little bit, what will happen is Elisha will go to Jehu and prophesy to him, hey, you're going to be the king. And guess what Jehu does? He goes ahead and kills the king, and he becomes the king. And then he kills the king's son, then he kills the king's brothers, and then he kills the king's mom. All a part of the story, but story for another day. Insignificant details. Anyways, so we don't know if this is Jehoram and Jehu, but he offers to talk to them. What we do know is that in the midst of this time, guess where all of the world events and political intrigue is happening? Valley of Jezreel. And so this offer is not an empty offer. They may be camped on the top of the hill. We don't know. Or they may be just around the corner. We don't know. But he offers, do you want me to go talk to the king or talk to the commander of the army? And she says back to him the best or one of the best one-liners in all of Scripture. She says, no, my family takes good care of me. The literal, I live among my people. That's a great line. I live among my people. I got my people and my people got me. There is nothing that I need. I am totally content. I live among my own people. I did not offer you hospitality to get something out of you. I offered you hospitality just as a gift. I'm good. I don't need a thing. And so, Elisha later on asked Gehazi, what can we do for her? And Gehazi replied, she doesn't have a son and her husband is an old man. Now, Elisha didn't apparently notice this, but Gehazi does. So Elisha's a prophet, but apparently not very perceptive. But Gehazi does notice, and this tells us a whole lot because it says that he's old, but she's not. That the limiting factor to her being able to have a son is not her age, but his age, which means that there's a significant age difference between them. And it's enough of an age difference that it could keep her or would keep her from having a child. And the unique thing about that is that that age is not as limiting of a factor for men as it is for women, right? On Friday, Al Pacino had a son. How old is Al Pacino? 83 years old. Well, I mean, he didn't have a son. His 39-year-old girlfriend had a son. I have nothing to say about any of that, but I do want to ask, anyone in here somewhere around that age, 83? Raise your hand. Come on, do it. Come on. Can you imagine having a son, brand new, right now? It's not as much a limiting factor for men as it is for women. I mean, now we have certain pharmaceuticals, I won't go down that road, which could help with that process, but then, of course, this was, for him, a limiting factor, and enough so that she would have no chance to have a son. And so Gehazi says to Elisha, her husband is very old, and she does not have a son. So Elisha says to Gehazi, call her back again. When the woman returned, this time Elisha speaks directly to her, or it doesn't tell us that there's an intermediary. Next year, at this time, you will be holding a son in your arms. He speaks this word over her. And her reply, no, my Lord, she cried. O man of God, Don't deceive me and get my hopes up like that. Don't you play with that one. Don't you push that button unless you really mean it. Don't give me false hope, she says. And yet, sure enough, it says, the woman soon became pregnant, and at that time, the following year, she had a son, just as Elisha had said. And this is the sixth miracle of Elisha. He speaks, and somehow a miracle happens, and she is able to have a son, and her husband is able to father a son. And so, the sixth miracle happens. Now, the story skips ahead, probably somewhere around 12 years. We're not entirely sure, but the word seems to kind of indicate that he's 12 years old when this next thing happens. And so, we don't really know much about the next time that Elisha showed up at her house. But I can guarantee you there were a few tears. Maybe it was during the pregnancy when she had started to show, or maybe it was that very next year when she was holding that newborn in her arms and she held him out. And Elisha had Gehazi take him. But can you imagine that moment? Maybe no words were said at all. 12 years later, or somewhere, one day when her child was older, that's why I think it's 12 years, that word older. It's a very specific word. He went out to help his father, who was working with the harvesters. And suddenly he cried out, "My head hurts, my head hurts." And his father, like any good father, said to one of the servants, "Take him to his mom." Happy Father's Day to you. It is biblical to say, talk to your mom. Talk to your mom. 2 Kings chapter 4, verse... it could be worse. On Mother's Day, I talked about toxic women. So this could be a whole thing. But he says, my head hurts, my head hurts. We don't know what that is. We don't know why his head is hurting. Lots of ideas. Some people think heat stroke. Some people think he just fell, bonked his head. Some people think aneurysm. Some people think meningitis. I mean, there's lots of things that could cause this. But he's got a headache, and so he sends him back to his mother. And then listen to this language and hear the emotion. So the servant took him home, and his mother held him on her lap, probably 12 years old, held him on her lap. 12-year-old. That's not easy, but you can see it still, can't you? Moving the hair aside from his forehead, gently kissing his cheek as she weeps, until about noontime, when he died. The story went sideways. It seemed to be going from A to B, and then it went sideways. You think one thing is happening, this is the blessing of God, and then all of a sudden the story goes totally sideways. And that happens to us, doesn't it? If it hasn't happened yet, it will. This is what happens in our lives. We think things are going a certain way, and then out of nowhere, in spite of the fact that it seems like God is blessing us a certain direction, everything goes sideways. It happens for her. This is the son, a gift from God, and all of a sudden, it goes sideways. And here is this great woman. So she carried him up and laid him on the bed of the man of God. And then she shut the door and left him there. She sent a message to her husband. Send one of the servants and a donkey so I can hurry to the man of God and come right back. His reply, why go today? He asked. It is neither a new moon festival nor a Sabbath. I mean, give me something to work with on Father's Day. Please, man. First time I read this, I thought, you bum. But the second time I read it, I realized she never told him that his son was dead. She never did. The last he knew, he's got a headache. He went to mom. And now, in the middle of the harvest, she wants a donkey and a servant. It is not the day off, he says. And it is not church day. Where do you think you're going? 20 miles to Mount Carmel? And she said, it'll be all right. It will be all right. The word shalom. It'll be okay. And so then she, and I love this, saddled the donkey herself and said to the servant, hurry, don't slow down unless I tell you to. Don't stop. Don't look back. Don't check to see how I'm doing. You just go, because she is a driver. She is the type of person who drives. She is the type of person to make sure we are moving from point A to point B quickly. She says, don't slow down. If I am in trouble, I will let you know. You just go as hard as you can towards Mount Carmel. And as she approached the man of God at Mount Carmel, Elisha saw her in the distance, and he said to Gehazi, look, the woman from Shunem is coming. Run out to meet her and ask her, is everything all right with you, your husband and your child? Shalom with you, shalom with your husband, shalom with your child. Yes, the woman told Gehazi, everything is fine, shalom. But when she came to the man of God at the mountain, she fell to the ground before him and caught hold of his feet. The same word that's used here for catching hold of his feet is the word that's used at the beginning of the story when she urged him to eat at her house. The thing that she had learned and used before, she uses here. When she lays hold of his feet, she will not let go, like Adonijah did not let go of the horns on the altar. She is there on the ground before Elisha, and she is not going to release. This is an incredible breach of etiquette for someone who would not even talk directly to her. But she does not care. She lays hold of the feet of Elisha, and Gehazi, it says, even tries to push her away. Gehazi began to push her away, but the man of God said, leave her alone. She is deeply troubled, but the Lord has not told me what it is. You know, in this story, Elisha doesn't look the best. He is a prophet of God, and he has no idea what's going on. Like, that's kind of your whole job as a prophet of God, is to know what's going on. But he has no idea because God, for whatever reason, did not reveal it to him. But she there on that day does. And so he says to Gehazi, leave her be. I don't know what's going on. She is shown in a beautiful light. He not as much. And you'll see it as the story continues on. He has no idea what's going on. And so she then says, did I ask you for a son, my Lord? And didn't I say, don't deceive me and get my hopes up? Now, Elisha may not be very perceptive, but he understands what this means. She never says her son is dead. In fact, nowhere in the story does she ever once say, my son is dead. But Elisha figures it out. And so he says to Gehazi, Gehazi, get ready to travel. Take the back of your robe, pull it around, stick it in your belt, gird up your loins. He says, turn your robe into shorts. You're going to run. And so he says, run. Go as fast as you can. Don't talk to anyone along the way. Go quickly and take my staff and go. Go quickly and lay the staff on the child's face. So he's saying go, and I guess he's expecting a miracle to happen when he does that. But the boy's mother said, as surely as the Lord lives and you yourself live, I won't go home unless you go with me. Where have we heard those words? Oh, Elisha gets it now. Those are the words he said to Elijah. I am not going anywhere. And she says it to him. I am not going anywhere unless you go with me. And so then Elisha gets it, and he returns with her. Gehazi's running on ahead in his shorts. I mean, they're following after. And guess what? She was right, and he was wrong. Gehazi hurried on ahead and laid the staff on the child's face, but nothing happened. There was no sign of life. He returned to meet Elisha and told him, the child is still dead. When Elisha arrived, the child was indeed dead, lying there on the prophet's bed. He went in alone and he shut the door behind him and prayed to the Lord. And then he laid on the child's body, placing his mouth on the child's mouth, his eyes on the child's eyes, his hands on the child's hands. And as he stretched out on him, the child's body began to grow warm again. Now that might seem weird to you, because it is. But this is exactly how Elijah heals the widow's son, raises him from the dead. This is saying something. And so it doesn't work. He warms up, but that's all he's got. So he gets up and he walks back and forth across the room once. And then he stretched himself out again on the child. This time the boy sneezed 7 times and opened his eyes. Lots of people have lots of ideas on why he sneezes 7 times. 7 very clearly is wholeness, completeness, total. He is fully alive. The sneeze is probably allergies. So it's harvest time. He's fully alive. The allergies are back. Elisha, you don't want to lay on him again, and but he's sneezing. So no, thank you. But he sneezes 7 times, opens his eyes. He is alive. Then Elisha summoned Gehazi, called the child's mother, he said. And when she came in, Elisha said, here, take your son. And he gives her son back to her. She fell at his feet and bowed before him, overwhelmed with gratitude. And then she took her son in her arms and carried him downstairs. What a story. What a story. Story that goes sideways, but what an absolutely beautiful story. And what a woman. Why is this not a woman that we use more as a model of what a great woman might look like? Because that's what the Bible calls her, a great woman. I mean, definitely incredible. She is secure enough in herself and her relationships with those around her that she is totally content. I don't need you to talk to the king or the commander of the army. I dwell among my own people. And she's in awe of Elisha. She respects Elisha. But she is not intimidated by Elisha. This is a strong woman. And yes, she seems to not be pursuing this having a son thing. But when it's offered to her, she does not refuse it. She is just against false hope. So she says, don't awaken that hope unless you really mean it, Elisha. Don't push that button. I'm not against it. I'm just against unrealistic hope. And then, when her son dies, she is focused and purposeful. And she, with absolute urgency, never once lets anybody else in, but goes directly towards the goal. She drives towards it. Why is this not the model for a woman at work? Why is this not the model for a woman negotiating a raise? Why is this not the model for a woman negotiating a loan or getting her car repaired or in relationship with her husband or standing up for the weak or others around her who might need it? This is a strong, focused, faith-filled woman. Why is she not the model for women who want a house remodel? Let us build. This is an incredible woman. And she steals the show. The story goes sideways because of how great she is. But she's not just a model for women. She is a model for every single one of us. Because here is a woman who, when the time comes and she has no other options, she lays down and never lets go. She wrestles with God like Jacob wrestled with God. Here is a strong woman. The most incredible part of it is when the story goes sideways, this driver goes sideways with it. Literally, she goes sideways all the way to Mount Carmel. Story goes sideways, I'm going sideways too. What an incredible, incredible woman. But the story's not over. It continues. A little later, in 2 Kings chapter 8, it picks up again with the story of this woman. It says in verse 1, Elisha had told the woman whose son he had brought back to life, take your family and move to some other place, for the Lord has called for a famine on Israel that will last for 7 years. Take your family, not your son, your family. What all that means, we don't know, but there's more than one. Maybe her husband is dead at this point, maybe not, who knows. Doesn't call her a widow. Take your family. He speaks to her, and so she did, as the man of God instructed. She took her family and settled in the land of the Philistines for 7 years. After the famine ended, she returned from the land of Philistines, and she went to see the king about getting back her house and land. You love that? She's not intimidated by Elisha. She's definitely not intimidated by some old king. And this may be King Jehu, probably is by this point. He reigns for 28 years, Jehoram only for 12. And so probably is Jehu. But she goes, because somewhere along the line, someone else took her property, maybe even the king himself, we don't know. But she goes and she just comes back and she decides, I want my house and my land back too. And as she came in, the king was talking with Gehazi, the servant of the man of God. And the king had just said, tell me some stories. Tell me some stories about the things, the great things Elisha has done. There's a really good chance that all the stories of Elisha that add up in the chapters before this are because of this very moment here, because there's a recorder in that room writing these things down. So, telling the great stories of Elisha, he tells the story of a great woman from Shunem. At that very moment, as she came in, the king was talking, and the king had just said, tell me some stories about the great things Elisha has done. And Gehazi was telling the king about the time Elisha had brought a boy back to life. At that very moment, the mother of the boy walked in to make her appeal to the king about her house and her land. How about the perfect timing of God? Literally could not have been planned any better than this. The king asks, tell me some stories. Gehazi says, all right, I'll tell you some stories. He raised this boy back to life, and in she walks. Gehazi is shocked. Here's what he says. Look, my lord the king, Gehazi exclaimed. Here is the woman now, and this is her son, the very one Elisha brought back to life. Is this true? The king asked her. And so she told him the story. God's timing is absolutely perfect. And just as in our lives when the story goes sideways, what I love about this story is in it, God doesn't waste a thing. You know what's amazing? How is she referred to in chapter 8, verse 1? Not as the Shunammite woman. Now, she is known as the woman whose son he had brought back to life. The very thing that she might have wanted to have skipped in the moment, when her story went sideways, is the very thing that becomes a part of her identity. God never wastes a thing. And when our stories go sideways, we know at the very least this, that he will use it in our life to form us. But then that's not it. The story's not over yet. And she told him the story. So he directed one of his officials to see that everything she had lost was restored to her, including the value of any crops that had been harvested during her absence. The very thing that was her story going sideways is used by God not only to form her, but in order to bless her to the point where she harvests 7 years in one day. And that's not always going to be the case, but sometimes it is. Where God will use the very thing that you think is my story going sideways to bless you. What an incredible thing this is. But even that is not the end of the story. Because this little town of Shunem and Mount Moreh and that little town to the northeast called Nain, that town, when the Greeks come in, they get tired of pronouncing that Hebrew word, and so they just shorten it to Nain. And in Luke chapter 7, Jesus and his disciples will be walking through this area. And he will come up on Nain. Just outside the city gates, a widow will be walking out with her dead son. All those hundreds of years later. Sometimes I struggle with the fact that Jesus didn't empty the cemeteries when he was here on earth. But he didn't. Not until he comes back again, he will. But then he didn't. But on this day, for this woman, for this boy, he does. He stops the funeral procession. He raises that boy up off that bier. And it says he gives him back to his mother. And immediately, all the people in that area say, a great prophet has arisen among us. You see, I guarantee you that the people of Nain, no more than a mile away from Shunem, would have thought of this area as the area where Elisha raised that boy all those years ago. And so on this day, when Jesus is walking through the area, the Holy Spirit says, not this day, not this boy, not this woman. And so Jesus raises her from the dead. And then the people see that just as Elisha was twice the prophet Elijah was, Jesus is more than twice the prophet Elisha was. And they get it. Immediately it communicates a message. Which means that this Shunammite woman's story going sideways has impact not just for her, but for someone she would never know far after her story was told. You see, God will use it in our lives when our story goes sideways in order to form us. Often, he will use it to bless us. Almost all the time, he will use it to impact someone else. And rarely, certainly not all the time, but rarely, when your story goes sideways, it's not the story going sideways. It is the universe itself tilting at the command of God. And you have no idea how your small part fits into the much grander story of God. So when your story goes sideways, be like this woman from Shunem, this woman whose son dies and is raised again. Do what she did. What does she do? She offers gratitude. In spite of so many things she doesn't understand, seemed like the blessing of God was moving from A to B and the story went sideways on her. What does she do? Before she takes her son back, what does she do? She offers gratitude. Even if you don't understand how it all works together, you offer gratitude. You say, oh God, I don't understand it all, but I thank you all the same because I know something. You will not waste this. You may bless me with it. You will probably impact somebody else. And maybe, just maybe, you are telling a much larger story than I could ever imagine. This is the story of this woman, but much bigger, it is the story of God.